Voices on the rise, dog is staring back at me. Foot a seat and the trees that keep you in the shade, moving up and down this street. Water royals under lights, she's marching the bikes, got magic in her fingertips. Keep it here in your mind, let it burn, some shivers up and down your
Good evening. I want to thank you all for joining us digitally this evening for our CCHM Speaker Series program. Now, these talks, they're sponsored by the Historic Preservation Commission of Clark County, and tonight's broadcast and all of our others have been sponsored by Wager Audio. So a big thanks to Wager Audio for what they're doing to make these happen. Now, our mission at the Clark County Historical Museum is to gather, save, and share the pieces and memory of Clark County history. And the Clark County Historical Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit, has been performing this mission for over 100 years. And it was over 50 years ago that the Society established our Clark County Historical Museum. Now tonight we have a special opportunity to bring our talk to you digitally and free of charge. Now, unfortunately, we would normally have these talks in the museum, but the museum is part of phase 3 of our state's Safe Start plan, so we're unable to open our doors just yet. So we're going to continue to connect with you digitally. So some of the ways that we're going to be doing this is on June 19th, we will be starting our virtual walking tour series, because we won't be able to come out and actually do our walking tours this year. So we'll be bringing tours to you each Friday at noon. And in normal years, we would actually have admission and people pay for tickets. But this year, we're going to bring it to you free of charge and suggest that you help us out with some donations while you watch the live stream. Now, our next speaker series will be coming up pretty soon. On July 2nd, we're going to have one that is sponsored by the Downtown Camas Association. And in this talk, we're going to celebrate Camas history and its downtown as a part of our Celebrate Main Street program. And we're even going to bring some people from downtown Camas to play a part in a Camas history quiz. And we'll also have a special guest, Virginia Warren, that will tell us a little Camas history. So it's going to be a really fun program. We're also going to continue our digital streams of History on Tap. We will present our next History on Tap program on Thursday, July 16th, with a talk that's going to be titled Washington Women Win the Vote. And that will begin at 7 p.m. that evening. And it's during this program that historian and author Shanna Stevenson will discuss Washington women's road to achieving the ballot and the suffragists who were part in winning that campaign. In addition, we'll still have our popular segment, Ask Pat, where we'll have Pat Jollota answer one question regarding Clark County history. And we will have our quiz game show, and we'll feature members of the League of Women Voters of Clark County during that time. We're also continuing our online workshops, so if you want to learn how to uncover the history of your home, business, or just know about general resources when it comes to online research, you can join us with those. Check out our Facebook page. And then we are still continuing our Capture the Moment collection. We know this time is a time of a lot of change in our community, and so much has happened. And so please continue to submit photos, video, writing, audio, and any other materials that represent this unique moment in our Clark County history. Also keep an eye out on our social media page for other work that we're doing out in the community. And now I'm going to hand off the program to Dr. Sue Peabody, a Meyer Distinguished Professor of History at Washington State University Vancouver. She's going to provide us with an introduction for tonight's program.
Hi, my name is Sue Peabody. I'm Professor of History here at Washington State University Vancouver, and I'm delighted to be here today to introduce our program, Clark County Women in Politics. Several years ago, it dawned on me that after living here for about 25 years, I'd witnessed a lot of changes in our community. The population has doubled here since 1988 to roughly 500,000 people. And those who have deep historical roots in the community have a lot of stories to tell. And those of us coming from elsewhere also have stories to tell and to share. And my thought was, if we can share these stories, we get to know each other a little bit better and work to make Clark County the best it can possibly be. So this year's programming is organized around Clark County Women in Politics. And it's celebrating the 100th anniversary of women achieving the right to vote here in the United States. And Dr. Donna Sinclair, who is a public historian, has decided to interview half a dozen women who have held public office here in Clark County or representing Clark County elsewhere. And in the process, she teaches us a lot about what it means to be an engaged citizen, what it means to be a participant in our democratic community. So with funding from the Pettyjohn Fund from Washington State University and the partnership with the Clark County Historical Museum, we are really, truly delighted to introduce Donna Sinclair and women in Clark County Women in Politics. Oh, and this was, okay, that's it. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I am so excited to see you here tonight, and I'm excited to share this project with you. This project stems from the Clark County Stories project that started several years ago in partnership with the museum and WSU Vancouver, where I teach public history. My students put together an exhibit that focused on individual stories and change in Clark County over the past 40 years in the midst of massive growth. And 2 years ago, Dr. Peabody and I built on this project by collecting additional interviews and engaging in community conversations. What we found was that across class, racial, and ethnic and gender lines, we typically have far more in common than otherwise. We care about our families, our communities, and our collective futures. And so with that in mind, and in light of the anniversary of women getting the vote 100 years ago, we extended our project to talk with women engaged in electoral politics from 1976 through the early 2000s, and in shaping Clark County as we know it today. So last summer, I interviewed 6 women for this project: city councilors, county commissioners, mayors, and state representatives. And those women included Connie Kearney, who was Clark County's first female county commissioner. She served from 1976 to 1980. Nan Henriksen, Camas city councilor starting in 1981, and mayor of Camas from 1983 to 1992. Nan was the region's first female mayor. Bessie Nutley, who served in the Washington State House of Representatives for the 49th Legislative District from 1985 to 1989, and then she became a county commissioner from 1991 to 1994. Then came Betty Sue Morris, who served in the State House for the 18th Legislative District from 1989 to 1996, and then joined the County Commission until 2008. Pat Jollota, Vancouver City Councilwoman from 1990 to 2010 and former director of the Clark County Museum. Judy Stanton, Clark County Commissioner from 1997 to 2004. Over the past 2 weeks, I recorded interviews on Zoom to share just a few of their stories with you. And I had the good fortune to add former Congresswoman Linda Smith to the group. Now, at times, the video isn't great, so you'll see that we're dealing with Zoom. These are the realities of the times that we live in. But I was very excited to be able to add Linda Smith to the group. She served in the 18th Legislative District House of Representatives from 1983 to 1987, and then in the state Senate until her 1994 election to the U.S. House of Representatives for the 3rd Congressional District in a write-in campaign that you will hear about tonight. In addition to former Congresswoman Smith, we will hear tonight from Connie Kearney, Nan Henriksen, Betty Sue Morris, and Pat Jollota. Bessie Nutley and Judy Stanton were unable to join us. Now, some of these women were firsts in Clark County. Others were close. You may have heard of Val Ogden, who served in the State House from 1991 to 2003. Her collection is held by the museum, but unfortunately, she is no longer with us. Neither is Jolene Unsold. Women like Val Ogden and Jolene Unsold and those highlighted here contributed to community development in ways that I am sure will surprise you. The women with us tonight have continued with their significant community engagement, from participation in creating the county charter and volunteerism in multiple organizations to philanthropy in the region, and Linda Smith's establishment of Shared Hope International, an organization dedicated to ending sex trafficking. Every one of these women has contributed several lifetimes worth of community service and operation and operating so many organizations and efforts that I cannot name them all here, and I really just can't even try. It would take the entire night. So the stories that I present tonight mark the development of women's right to vote. This summer is the 100-year anniversary, and in August, an exhibit focused on that right will open at the Clark County Museum. Now, throughout tonight, I will intermittently speak through the program, but only to give you some context for the responses. These women's stories speak to an important era of change, and I will leave it to you to consider the challenges that they faced, their roles in shaping their communities, their successes, and what it means to be a woman in political life in Clark County. The stories begin with some reflections on gender roles and expectations for these women who later became community leaders. So we're going to start with Nan Henriksen, then Connie Kearney, and Pat Jollota. So here we go.
I would say at home, the expectations were quite high for both the boys and girls. In reality, there were always reminders that we girls had our proper places and places that were not. I remember one of the most vivid ones was when I ran for student body president when I was in high school. And sadly, found out that girls were not to be presidents of, back then, of the student body. And the same thing was true in college. I had great grades and all that, but had to face the reality. I thought I would go into medicine, planned from the time I was quite young that I would be a doctor. And I had a very high grade average in zoology pre-med. But back then it was interesting that the medical school would only allow 2 women per year in the class in medical school. And even those 2 were made to feel that they were actually taking the place of a man who would actually practice medicine and wouldn't just get married and have children, because they knew you couldn't do both. So there were those reminders as we went along that we could do a lot of good things, but we did need to remember our place. But I certainly don't remember that at home. The expectations were very high for all of us.
About gender growing up. I grew up in Baker, Oregon, which is a tiny town in eastern Oregon, about 9,000 people. It now has still 9,000 people, but they call themselves Baker City. But my parents were divorced when I was a little girl, and I lived with my grandmother for a period of time. So my grandmother had a big role in my life growing up. And she always said to me, "You're going to go to college." It wasn't any if I go, it was always I will go. And I don't think I thought about what I would do when I went to college, but I was going to college. So by the time I was a senior, then I started thinking about occupations. But I never had anybody around me saying girls should be teachers or girls should be nurses. I never experienced that growing up.
Of course, as I said before, I grew up in Southern California that had a more relaxed attitude toward what women could do. But there were invisible walls, as I'm sure Nan found out when she ran for student body president. A woman on the Los Angeles Police Department could go really no higher than sergeant. There was one job called that had a lieutenant's pay, and that was called city mother.
Oh, Lord. Oh, excuse me.
Don't you love it? No one could ever define to me just what the city mother did, but she got a lieutenant's pay. That's another long story of women fighting for what they wanted and needed. And there was one woman who sued because she had always taken the test, always scored high, never got an oral interview. And so when she retired, she sued and won. And I tell the women in law enforcement that I meet today, thank Fanchon Blake for what you've got today, because without her, you'd still be city mothers. But now in my own home, my mother and father were from Texas, so they had that Southern, women shall be ladies, women shall dress nicely. My mother had been a fashion buyer for a large department store in her younger days. She had been a model. And so it was very important to her that how we looked was so important. A lot more than it is today. Today we can be who we are. Then we had to make sure that everything, oh, your lipstick is sweet. You have lipstick on your tooth. Oh my goodness, These were major things, not what is your philosophy in life, none are you a good person, it was how do you look.
So Linda Smith came to Clark County as a girl and graduated from Fort Vancouver High School in 1968. She then married Vern Smith, with whom she found a strong sense of belonging.
Well, he was in college. I was going to start. I started taking tax law classes. I became a consultant, a tax consultant in Oregon. Started working for TJ Enterprises, which had H&R Block franchises. So I would be in that line. It wasn't a degree. I just became very good at that. So I started managing all the offices and eventually the ones in Southwest Washington. When I left and joined Congress about a year after, I realized I really couldn't be doing that from January to April, and I could teach in the fall, but it was not going to work. If I was going to be a public servant, I had to make a decision. Financially, my husband said, that's okay. We'll be just fine. And so it became something I needed to give up. So I was with TJ Enterprises 15 years. And I did that. It was very good. It was a networking also. I had 400 and some Clark County clients, small business, corporations, nonprofits, and individuals. And so I kind of developed a network, not meant to be anything but relationally, but people that trusted me, which became very valuable in the writing campaign later. People stepped across from being a Democrat to a Republican to write Linda Smith Republican on the ballots. Nothing really starts in our life at any one point. It's always, what kind of reputation did you have before?
Many, though not all, of the women in this project had expectations of becoming mothers and perhaps teachers. When asked about the women's movement, here's what Betty Sue Morris and Linda Smith had to say.
Oh. But there was just this undercurrent of dissatisfaction with what the rest of my life was going to play out as, instead of what it could play out as. And so that was what happened. I have had moments of sudden realization, but that wasn't one of them. It was not sudden. I will tell you what else was going on at the same time was almost as disruptive as what we see right now, because we had Martin Luther King was killed, Bobby Kennedy was killed. We had the Vietnam War, protests against that, the Kent State demonstrations where students were actually shot. We had the Watts riots. I remember seeing tanks, military tanks, roll down Michigan Avenue in Chicago. That's where I was living at the time. And so it wasn't just the women's movement, it was that everything was ripping loose. And somehow or other, it allowed me to rip loose too. That's the best description I can give to you. But if you're a little girl from Kansas who is protected, and all of a sudden you see tanks rolling down the street, it's thunder and lightning.
I think most of us knew when we realized that the pension our husband was earning as we were watching the children would go with him. And so you look at some of these women's movements, they were just women. They weren't Democrat, Republican, the same as when you watched Susan B. Anthony or the other leaders. You look at this, and it was women coming together to work to affect people around them. And in big cases, it was their husbands, because that's who they could get the ear of. But at the same time, more my era, we had certain things that were troubling to us that we knew economically were going to be wrong. So we might try to build our own economic base. So I had my own stock, my husband had his stock. That wasn't, after a while, it made no difference. But it was important to me that even though I trusted him, that I did everything I could to advance myself. So if something happened to him, I would not be hung out, or unfortunately, so many of my friends, the guy was getting to 40 and getting a young girlfriend or wife and leaving their wife, and no way could they support the children. And if they died, they didn't get their pension either. So a lot of us were involved in pension reform way back for years. We've known that needed to be fixed. That then meant that we better fix the state actuaries to acknowledge those things. So some of the first things I looked at was how well different pension funds were funded in general. So when I came in 83 to the state legislature, that was an issue on my mind. Now that had more to do with the women that were training me in my offices who were trying to build a life. They maybe just became an H&R Block tax preparer, a basic preparer, or maybe they had not that ability and I could start them on the program, which would be an entry-level job, and they could do that. So I was getting to know more and more of them in my comfort zone with my husband, who I got to where I knew more and more and more. The man wasn't moving. He loved me, and to the day he died, he was faithful to me and non-apologetic. But that made me very, very safe. But also meant for women that I had greater responsibility. And so these women started showing me. I mean, I had in the first Shared Hope Win program, 2 of them, one's husband had broke his neck. They had a small business. She was all of a sudden in deep trouble. She had nothing. She was not educated to any extent, and she hadn't developed any skills, but she had these 3 beautiful babies. Now, she ended up coming into Shared Hope. She wasn't there as a sex traffic victim or whatever, but she was a woman whose children would have been vulnerable had we not helped her stabilize her life. So she learned skills. We aligned what she could do with medical and things with her children, trying to figure out a whole. He passed away, and we ended up working with her. She worked for Shared Hope for many years, and
So based on that story, Linda Smith is telling us about the Women's Investment Network that she started when she was in business. Some of that was necessary in part because women did not have access to the same kinds of jobs and resources that men did. There was the 1963 Equal Pay Act, and in 1972, the Equal Employment Opportunity Act was passed. It wasn't until then that women were able to enter into professional life at any sort of large scale. It took until the 1980s for women to get into all kinds of professions. So one of them, of course, is the one that Pat Jollota talked about, being a dispatcher. And she mentioned some things earlier about a woman suing the police department. But what you don't get to hear is her wonderful story about how the police department actually helped her gain the voice of authority that she needed to engage in politics. When she first started as a young woman, she had a very high-pitched voice, and later on, after working as a dispatcher for quite a while, that had changed. But it really helped her in the long run. One of the things I asked these women about was, what were the motivations for them to become politicians? So as you watch the next several clips, think about what commonalities do you see?
And I was involved with PTA and other organizations, women's groups, and we, some of us thought that the Klein Line gravel pit was a health hazard and a danger in our community. And so that's how I got involved with government, going to the county board and asking them to do something about this eyesore. And one thing led to another, and the county commissioner wasn't supportive and sort of put us off. And we all said, well, we need someone that really cares about parks and cares about what's going on in this part of the county, and we need to have someone run for office. And my friends turned to me and said, Connie, how about you? And that's how it started. I wasn't involved in politics before. I was had to decide whether to be a Democrat or a Republican, and I'd grown up in a family that was Democratic, and my husband's parents were Republican. But the incumbent was a Republican, so it made it kind of easy to decide that the Democratic Party was where I would register to campaign. And the Democrat local committee was a little surprised to see me show up because they hadn't heard of me before. but didn't take long, and the party accepted me and provided support. When I campaigned, I had my sign said Connie for commissioner. And I think probably I was one of the first candidates to ever just use a first name in campaigning. Remember, this was back in 1976. And I had supporters that held signs on street corners, which I think was also maybe a first in our county. But I had wonderful, wonderful people helping me run for election, and I couldn't have done it without them.
Well, it was a circuitous road and very accidental. After my Annie's daddy, my daughter, and I divorced, my parents had moved out here, so I came out for the summer with Ann to go to the University of Portland and get my master's degree. And I met the cutest guy. he was in my 7 a.m. statistics class. And if you could spark romance at 7 a.m. in a statistics class, you've got a chance at lasting relationship. So that was in the summer of 1970. We were married in December of 1970, and that brought me to the West Coast. And then how did I get into politics? Oh my goodness, as I said, totally by accident. I hadn't really planned to go to work. I substitute taught for a while. My husband and I had a little volunteer newspaper in the Hazeldale area called Hazeldale Gazette. We published it every month. It was a volunteer, and we ran as a nonprofit, and it was fun. And we met lots and lots of people. And then we tried to compete with the Columbian, and that was abject failure. They knocked us out of business in about a week and a half. And so there was a job opening at the hospitals at St. Joseph. This is ancient history, and many of the people who watch this and know you will not even remember that there used to be two separate hospitals in the county, and there was St. Joe's and there was Vancouver Memorial. And at that time, there was a move to consolidate the two, and there was great outroar about it. And so in the meantime, between the Hazeldale Gazette and this experience, I had been recruited by the Oregonian. And so I had been a part-time reporter for the Oregonian, and I had covered the county and the city of Vancouver as well as the Vancouver School Board. So when this job came open at the hospitals, I was asked to apply, and I did. I was not their first choice, but their first choice turned them down. And so they asked me, and I was there until 1982, when Medicare reduced its payments and all hospitals sliced staff. And my department, as well as any other non-direct patient care service, was cut.
I think there were a couple of things that caused me to run the first time when I ran for city council. One of them was that growing up, I learned that when something isn't right, you don't just sit and gripe, but you get out there, you find other people, and you make it better. And so when I was in my late 30s, well, mid to late 30s, I was running the front end of my father's drugstore and very active in the Chamber of Commerce. And the Chamber of Commerce board that I was serving on, the people were always just grousing about the lousy quality of our city council and city government. But then when the time would come to run, no one would file. It was a lot easier to complain than it was to get out and do it. So I waited when my ward was, the position was up. I didn't file right away. I waited till the last day, and the woman that was the incumbent that so many people were grousing about was the only one that had filed. So that Friday afternoon, I went down and filed. And it was just because I felt it was so important that the Camas City Council have more consistency and predictability and all those things, good planning that were not happening at the time.
So we built this network that was not meant to be anything other than that's relational, and it became what was called Linda's Army. Now, I thought that was really kind of funny because they were just people that didn't even know each other. There were nearly 10,000 people around the state that could take action at any one time. And so there were captains around the state, and they could then instigate a certain amount of momentum around them, but everyone was important. They knew that if they didn't take action, they could break this chain of action. The Democrat, Republicans, I think at one point Ross Perot's people were in it. That was an interesting era. And of independent, you know, how these folks always that are independent. And so that's what it just built over the years. Vern is was a very, I guess you could say, steady person. Not anything, very rarely did anything shake my husband. And because he was really steady and I was a little bit more, I guess you could say, outgoing or outspoken, he said, "You need to run for office, Linda. You need to run for office." And it was right at the right time, because in 1983, right around that time, you know, you have those years that are up and down. The states are affected right now in 2020. They're being affected. And so they're trying to raise more money. And what Washington State did is double the business and occupation tax.
In 1987, there was a vacancy in the 18th Legislative District Senate, and Joe Tanner was appointed to fill that. And Linda Smith, who had been in the House of Representatives and was a Republican, she ran against him, and she beat him. And no one expected it, but she beat him. And on the morning after that election, when I first woke up, it had been a close election, and I learned that Linda had won and her seat would be vacant in the House. It's like I knew. I knew it as certainly as I knew that I wanted to marry Bill Morris, that this was the clear direction. Nobody said it, but I knew it.
It was important to me that the citizens of Camas be brought together to determine our preferred future, and not sit back and let things happen to us and 20 years later be complaining about what unplanned growth, how it had ruined us. And we were faced with an even bigger challenge because for 100 years, our community had relied on a paper mill that when I became mayor was providing over 2,500 jobs and was paying more than 70% of the total property tax income of the city of Camas. That tells you that all the rest of the businesses, the homes, everybody were paying less than 30% of the total property taxes for our community. So we had a lovely community with lots of parks and good things, but it was all based around one goose with the golden egg. Yes, we had a lot of pollution, but we also had a lot of prosperity with all those well-paid jobs and all that property tax. But many of us could see that the mill had almost closed totally in the 70s, and there was no predictability for a long time future, that either it would die suddenly like it almost did, or it would slowly die. Was one part of it, and really solid homework to see about the doability of the vision before we made any huge steps was important too. But the vision needed to include the citizens. And I felt that had been gravely lacking previously. And so we needed to get folks together to come up with a common vision. And then we needed solid help from consultants to look at the feasibility of, could this small town take that huge step into the Fisher Basin? What would that look like? What are the odds of success? And so once elected, we did a lot of good homework after the visioning sessions on the feasibility. And what it all boiled down to is the risk of doing nothing was much greater than the risk of taking the big step. That didn't mean the odds were good either way, but certainly we felt that that's what we needed to do.
I'm here for the historicity of the city. And I had gotten the job at the Grant House, and almost immediately, my goodness sakes, Officers Row.
Mm-hmm.
The government proposed to auction off the houses on Officers Row, one house at a time. Well, we can't have that. I came here to be in historic preservation, where, so I got involved with Congressman Bonker's committee, and Mayor Seidel had formed a committee, and then they joined the two. And I worked very hard, very, very hard with that committee. And then I will never forget the afternoon sitting in City Council office. I wasn't on the council yet, of course. And the mayor called from Washington, D.C. and said, good news and bad news. The good news is we have the row. The bad news is we have the row. We had 23 white elephants, nose to tail, marching down Evergreen. Now, what are we going to do with it? And that, I got so involved in that action, that discussion, but I wasn't ready yet to get involved in the political end of it. I was very happy with my little job as curator in the museum. And then it was proposed to turn the museum into a restaurant. Not even a restaurant, a high-end men's club. Well, it had been a museum for 40 years. The Seroptimists had run it nicely. Excuse me. And so I protested. And I was not treated well by the council. So I gathered support of other people to come to City Council and protest with me. And I was treated even worse. And then one day there was something, I think it was for the police department, that I thought I would go to City Council and listen to it. And it was Rose Besserman who came up to me and said, we're not talking about the row or the museum tonight. And I said, well, Rose, I'm not a single issue person. And she said, until you're on the City Council, you're always a single issue person. And I came home quite upset one night. And my husband said, hey, complain to me. If you want to change policies, you have to be a policy maker. Yep. Those two statements went right into my heart.
So in order to become a policy maker, you have to get elected. So we're going to share a few stories of campaigning with you now. And so here we go.
Just using my first name, Connie, was a way of saying, look, this is a gal. The newspapers, I mean, sure, we probably took advantage of it when I think back as part of my campaign, that here is a woman that has credentials. She's should be considered. And I think the novelty, I suppose, maybe that helped me. But I worked hard. I did a lot of doorbelling. I do remember going to the door of one house when I was out knocking, and this woman says, "Oh, you belong at home. No way would I vote for you." So I can remember saying to her, "But you're missing out on a whole lot of folks if you exclude women from public affairs." So maybe there was a little bit of, and I know my opponent was saying, you know, she doesn't have the experience. She should be home washing her dishes. So that's true, that happened, but that was when I was campaigning. Now you got to recall, this is 40 years ago, and the sensitivity and all of that about women's rights and so forth. I mean, it was a little different then. It was a kinder time too, in many ways, to be a politician than in today's environment.
I started aligning to some of his positions, and yet at the same time, I was just a business person, a mom, a Sunday school teacher. All of that seemed to be totally not me. But I started waking up to how government actions can affect just normal people. And it made a difference to me. And then I just hit the streets. Once Vern said, "But Linda, you would be a better politician than me." And I didn't know if that was a compliment or if it was something else. But yeah, because I didn't see politicians as being anyone I wanted to be. But I finally did, and we put together a fairly high quality flyer, and I walked and Vern walked, and then people started walking with us neighborhoods, and I lost over 20 pounds of walking.
Well, I knew that. Besides, I had begun to understand a lot about campaigns, and I'd made these marvelous connections all the way through the 18th Legislative District because I was Don Bonker's assistant. I knew people all over Clark County from my days as a newspaper reporter and my days with the Hospital Association. So it was, yes, it was certain. Well, it was fun. It was fun. And I understood it. And I knew that that's where I was going to be going. I don't know if other people ever feel that way when they're going to run for office, but I did. And it was a fun campaign. I enjoyed the campaign. I was looking through some of my campaign materials, and unfortunately, I can't find anything left from that first campaign. But it was always personal with me, and I always tried to kind of personally connect with the voters.
That's when it got more interesting. When I ran for city council, there wasn't a big pushback about a woman running for city council. In fact, the incumbent was an older woman. But when I sat on the council, I discovered quite quickly that there was a real leadership void on the council, and that there was very little communication between the mayor and the city council, and that we were headed in a bad direction. So I decided that if no one else was going to do it, I was going to run against this male incumbent. And that's where I found that there again, kind of like student body president, there was a real pushback of folks that knew me, liked me, but just could not see themselves voting for a woman for mayor. You got to remember back then there'd never been a woman mayor in Camas, and there were no other women mayors in all of Southwest Washington. So that took on a very different complexion. I still kept the high road and ran on what I would like to accomplish and all those sorts of things. But there was a pushback, even though the city was not being run well at the time. There was a lack of comfort at what was this person doing. She's got 3 children. She's working full time. She's got all this going, and what in the world is she doing running for mayor? So there was that pushback.
So I don't know about all of you, but I sure hear grit and determination in the voices of every one of those women. Now, Pat Jollota lost her first race for city council, but not by much. When an opening came up on the Vancouver City Council to replace Mary Legre, she applied, but she wasn't called for an interview.
But no, why wasn't I called? Why wasn't I? Well, let's see about that. So I discussed it with my long-suffering husband, who agreed, and I filed. Basically on historic preservation, not just Officers Road, not just the Grant House, but the idea of what Vancouver had overlooked is that historic preservation is a economic tool. A charming town will bring people to it. It will bring businesses to it. And you can do that with historic preservation. And instead of just tearing everything down, instead of just, as Los Angeles had done, have people invest in their own community, not with money, but with their hearts, to preserve it, to keep it, to love it. And if you love it, you want to keep it. So I filed against Ron Hart, a 6-foot-something-inch Baptist minister incumbent, and I lost. But I did take 47% of the vote. And people who knew politics told me that was very good. I didn't see it that way. I saw I lost. But they said 2 years later, Ethel Lehman, another woman, left the council and left a vacant seat. And everyone said, go for it. I said, but I lost. I've never been able to collect money. I can't. So what I had to do was go out and ring doorbells. And I walked through 2 pairs of shoes. I rang as many doorbells as I could. And you see, I kind of like to talk. So I was never ring the doorbell, I'm Pat Jollota, I'm running, thank you, go. I had to stop and talk to everyone.
So sometimes that's what it takes. These women did whatever it took to get themselves elected, but they weren't the first ones to enter political life from Clark County. However, they were close. Ella Wintler went to the State House of Representatives for the 17th Legislative District from 1951 to 1959. Linda was the next state legislator. She would also follow Jolene Unsold, who had succeeded Julia Butler Hanson in the 3rd Congressional District. Women like Hilma Powers, Jean Norwood, Rose Besserman, Mary Legre, and Ethel Lehman served on the Vancouver City Council. Pat and Linda Horowitz were next in 1990.
Well, again, if I just speak about Clark County, when I was a commissioner, the governor was female, Dixie Lee Ray. Betty Sue Morris, I think, was in the legislature. There were quite a few women active in politics that locally. And now, of course, we have 2 senators that are female from the state of Washington. So I would say women, I mean, I do believe that someone needs to be the best qualified. I don't think someone should be chosen because they're female or because of their sexual orientation or anything else. But I really think that women are doing pretty well.
Well, you know, there's always been some women. There's a historic piece at the U.S. Capitol, and there is a history piece where I'm featured within that, women in Congress. And so when you go back, though, there just aren't as many. And they had to literally break down the door. At the state Senate, there were a few, but not proportionate. So I think there were like 11%, but not very many. I shouldn't use a percentage. And so they were already breaking down doors, and when we got there, they were there. So Jeanette Hayner was the Senate leader when I was elected, and a woman from Walla Walla. And her style was very strong, but also very much pulling a lot of people together. She became my mentor. I watched her and met with her because I was elected as one of the leaders in the Senate when I was elected to the Senate. So that was part of the criteria. I said, you know, I'll go ahead and do this, run in 87 for the Senate, but I want to be in leadership. I want to be on rules, ways and means, and either chair healthcare, or chair children and family services. And yes, I'll do the work, but that's what I want. I don't think they thought it would win. But when I won, then they honored that. So I was in leadership, one of the 5, leaders. I think there were 5 top leaders. And she was amazing. She might be one of the strongest mentors I had. But when I was elected to Congress, it wouldn't be like some areas where they say, well, there aren't very many, there are more women elected now than there were back, 20, 30 years ago, a lot more everywhere. But at that point, our district already had Julia Butler Hansen.
And Julia Butler Hansen was a congresswoman in the 3rd Congressional District from 1960 to 1974. She played a major role in retaining Fort Vancouver as a National Historic Site. So you were in good company, Linda. One of the questions that I asked the women about was, what was it like to be a woman in office? And when I asked them, they told me different things. They had varied responses. Some of them talked about issues of representation.
It was never an issue for me. I never felt that I was patronized or ignored, or what I had to say wasn't given the weight that the other commissioners. I just really felt that it wasn't an issue. And I know women talk about being patronized and their opinions being disregarded, but that did not happen to me. Or if it did, I was naive enough not to recognize it. I told about Dick Granger, who was one of the commissioners while I was there. Two of the years Dick was there, and he would call me the Betty Boop of the courthouse. And you could say, well, I should be insulted by that. But Dick was a friendly, loving, kind man, and it was his way of being sweet and teasing me. And I never took it to be a hit on my femininity. In fact, I guess I was flattered, because Betty Boop back in those days wasn't she a sex symbol of some sort of animation? So I just don't recall anything happening because I was a woman.
It was really interesting because people will say, what did you expect? And I had no idea. I mean, I went from a campaign for a couple of months to being elected to something I didn't ever want to be in, originally. And so I guess I grew to respect people that stepped out financially, because most of the time you have the ability to make a lot more money or build your career. So here I was, pretty young. I was 31. And I love PR. There's a lot of things I was planning to do. And you end up putting it on hold and you don't have those productive years, or some are older and they're already done, and some maybe have a lot of money because of family. But for some of us, it was really thinking it through, and there were a lot of them that truly cared about carrying the issues they were passionate about forward. I remember a judge who was a good friend of mine, and she was on the Democrat side, and we would go out and debate something aggressively and go off to the side afterwards and say, yeah, you did really well this time, to each other. We kept a very strong relationship of friendship, but we had differences. Well, obviously, as a judge, she probably could have done a lot better somewhere else. So I remember, though, thinking, this is crazy. So you had your office in a building, and you had like 15 minutes to run to the floor to vote. And there were a lot of procedural votes. And there were votes where you were voting and arguing or debating and voting and debating. But you would always have to just close down your committee and run, or if you're in the office or a committee. One day, I'm going, okay, I have to get there. I'm missing it. I am running, and I decide to cut across the grass. Now, it does say, do not walk on the grass. I sunk up to practically halfway to my knees, and I looked up, and there were a group of kids there, and they started chatting. I thought, okay, I still have to get to the floor. So I bowed, I pulled my foot up, took off my shoe, pulled the other one up, and then slogged out, and then ran, stood in a sink for a couple of minutes just to get my feet cleaned enough, and then ran on and voted on the floor of the House. Now, I have to say that was humbling, but it just, there's things like that you go, we're just people. Every one of the people here is trying to make this really weird schedule and accomplish what they've told people they would do. So it was humbling. I did realize when I hit the Senate some things that were very interesting. There wasn't a woman's bathroom. I only noticed it when I got to the Senate and going, what's wrong with this? And they said, well, you can go out. There's public bathrooms out there. I said, yeah, and I'm going to walk right in to all of the lobbyists and people. Well, there is a spot back there, and it was the janitor's closet that had a toilet at the back of it. So I had this kind of meeting with the other women saying, let's not do this. The long and the short of it was I used to joke, and I don't know anymore, that I wrote the bill on toilet paper and put it out there. But there's procedures that you can be heard on. And not long, and the women have their lounge. I had men tell me, well, if you want a place, you can hang out with us. And I said, I just don't want to hang out with people that are tooting and burping and smoking cigars. So it's my choice, and I am a woman. I might not be a male member, but I am just as qualified as you are, and I'm not going to do that. Well, it didn't take me very long going in the closet to go, no way am I going to do this. So we got the Lieutenant Governor's office turned into a woman's lounge. It's there today, and that was the power of a few women and men not wanting to be embarrassed by the debate is what carried it forward.
Now, that the county, we passed a comprehensive land use plan. So that was a big deal back then to allocate land uses throughout the county. We opened Vancouver Mall, the shopping mall, and we're involved in the public works projects that went around the mall to make it accessible. And I-205 bridge was under construction. Not that we as the county board had anything to do with it, but it opened up our county immensely with that bridge and the access to East Clark County. Let's see. Well, we passed a noise ordinance, I remember. And of course, Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, May, and that was a big deal in Clark County. And we were so fortunate that the explosion went east towards Yakima versus south or north, because Clark County would have been very negatively harmed. But we still had lots of ash, and our public works were trying to clear the streets, and we had dignitaries from all over coming to Clark County to see the mountain, and the headquarters for the geographical folks was in Clark County. So that was an exciting time. Well, one time somebody asked us to write a letter to Barbara Streisand and inviting her to come to Clark County to put on a concert. And we all commissioners signed the letter, and of course, it didn't happen. Another time we had a big hearing about the gravel mining in Clark County, and we had a rock singer singing some kind of rock song while we were taking testimony. So we had a lot of funny things happen. And then I was only in office my first year, and all the county employees went on strike. And so and I wasn't the chair of the commission at that time. Dean Cole was the chair, but he was at some conference out of state. So I was the acting chair, and I had to deal with crossing the picket line, deal with the county attorney to get legal help. And it didn't take long to realize that what the county needed was expertise in labor negotiations. They had no one at that time. So I probably was instrumental in encouraging the board to have somebody with the expertise to be a labor negotiator. It was an abandoned gravel pit, partially filled with water and garbage and junk, and kids would climb down into it and would try to swim or try to fish, and it was dangerous and a hazard. And with some effort, we were able to get grant money. We were able to get the property donated. That the value of the property was used as a match for federal funds. And with various funding sources, we were able to raise enough money for the construction of the park. And now it's a regional park. I mean, there's trails that start at Klein Line, which is right at the west side of I-5, and go all the way to almost to Vancouver Lake. So there's soccer fields now, and it's just a wonderful place. And I've always been really proud and felt good about being part of making that happen back in the 70s.
Well,
as you look back on them, the biggest ones aren't the really special ones that I remember. The biggest one was probably juvenile justice reform. I chaired the corrections committee, and we made a major overhaul to our whole juvenile justice system. But probably the one I'm most proud of was called the bicycle bill. And we had these little pins. Can you see that it's a little bicycle plastic pins, and they were lapel pins. And we got these on everybody to get support for the bill. I will make this true statement. Everyone goes to the legislature and they are influenced by who they are themselves and their own experiences. And so is the legislation that they produce. In 1990, my husband broke his neck riding his bicycle. So I go busting up to Olympia, and I'm going to do some major laws about the rights of patients, because he had been badly treated at Kaiser when they first took him in. And I also believed that we needed to start having bicycle paths that weren't in the middle of streets for cars. So I introduced legislation, and it didn't all come to pass. But the reason you have a bicycle stripe on the side of the road and with a bicycle lane is because William G. Morris broke his neck falling off his bicycle in 1990. Now, no one would know that. I know it. So it's little things like that that you are really, really proud of. And then, you didn't ask me what I was proud of from being at the County Board of Commissioners. But besides that, the Fish Recovery Board and land use, planning on all the rest of this stuff, one of the things I love the most was my first summer at the Clark County Fair. And I went into the ladies' restroom, and at least half of them were out of order. Now, the line was stretching back about a quarter of a mile, and by the time I finally got in there, I can tell why it was. So I pick up my little cell phone and I call Doug Johnson, who was the head of facilities, and I said, Doug, do you know what? Half of the potties for the women at the fairgrounds don't work. Will you fix them? Those things were fixed in 2 hours. And it's like, okay, I understand girl power. A simple little phone call. And if I hadn't been a woman, I wouldn't have gone into the potty and I wouldn't have had to wait so long and I wouldn't have seen that half the stalls didn't work. So that's just another little either tender touch or not so tender touch, but one of the little assets about having women in elected office.
I love those stories. I laughed aloud again, and I've heard that one several times. One of the things that I hope is becoming clear is that representation actually matters. Now, it may not matter in ways that seem apparent, but individual action can make a difference. And I love the way that Betty Sue frames this notion of who you are influencing how things happen. These are things that we often don't see. And, you know, Connie talks about things that changed on the material landscape. She's not the only one who has done that. Linda Smith talks about getting a bathroom in the Senate of the Washington State Senate. So women do make a difference. And it's pretty interesting when you think about oral history and the way that these stories can reveal things that none of us would otherwise know. Now, sometimes it's hard to do what your community wants. Nan Henriksen learned that when she engaged in a process that expanded and annexed land for the city of Camas and brought high tech into Camas. There you go.
Without an ability to make it happen, and that I would somehow stop that, and it would be sensible and back to our little enclosed town that had been the same for 50 years, basically population and all. So when we did our homework and I came out to the city council and said, excuse me, and said, this is all the homework we've done. Now you, city council, have to decide if you want us to move forward on this plan or if you'd rather not. But I do want you to know that if you decide to move forward, the staff and I will work our buns off to make it a reality. And that really upset a lot of those who had supported me because they felt that I was ruining their wonderful little town. And so that's when things got really rough. I had the business, my own business that had been my dad's. And people were saying they wouldn't shop at my store anymore because I was ruining their town. And it made it really difficult because you don't make any money as a small town mayor. So I had to make my living elsewhere. And that was discouraging, but we plowed through. And so I'm proud of that.
But of all of the things we did in 20 years would be the Children's Justice Center. I think I've mentioned this before. We set up a partnership with the Vancouver Urban Growth Management Act. What would be the most benefit to the city and the county? There wasn't enough money to do a big thing, but there was a good chunk of money. And the wonderful people, then Art Curtis, who was prosecuting attorney, Frank Kennecoe was sheriff. These people sat down and said, what we have to do is protect our children, to rescue their childhood if it's being taken from them. There's really not enough money to do this, but if we kick in some money, you kick in some money, and we turn to the public for donations, we can do it. Now it's called the Arthur Curtis Children's Justice Center. In those days, it was called the Child Abuse Intervention Center, which really told more what they did, intervene. And one day, representative came from Larch Mountain the prison. And the men there had made quilts, little quilts, beautiful, intricate quilts for the children. And they said one of the prisoners had said, if there had been somebody who would have listened to me when I was a child, I wouldn't be here.
One of the things I love about that story is that Pat goes on to talk about the Elder Justice Center that also eventually came about in Clark County, and she is also a part of that. As I said, all of these women have ongoing connections to community and are still engaged in service work at many levels. Now, sometimes accomplishments come unexpectedly, and with Linda Smith, she did not intend to go to Congress, but she did. So let's hear her story.
And we just won the Supreme Court case, state Supreme Court case on the last initiative, and I was exhausted. Between raising money for it and working, I was just exhausted. And so we went away for 3 days just to rest at the beach. That would be the holiday, September, the first part. It had just started, and somebody said, we really want to do a write-in. My flippancy was this: I am an organizer. I guess that's what they're called now. I know how. I would not call on Linda's Army to do this. Or the people that would support me, because I don't think they're going to work. You don't have enough time. I have said more and more, I can't run because I don't believe in special interest money. I would, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to reach out for lobbyists or PACs. I'm just not going to do it. And so you don't have enough time, and I'm exhausted, and I don't have any money. And I left. Over the weekend, they started organizing, getting people's postage machines and copy machines. I think one of them was the International Air Academy. They used their equipment, and they had it ready. When I got back, I think Tuesday of the next week, I was called and said, we've done this over the weekend. Will you let us mail it? And I'm going, gosh, that's a lot of waste. And again, I said, I don't think it'll work. If you get the votes, I'll run. And I didn't think I would. So I wasn't willing. I wasn't proactive. And those were people from the 3rd Congressional District all the way up through Lewis County, I think in the lower part of Thurston and up the gorge. And they just started. And again, it's like people are, when they do something, it can be pretty powerful.
We bring to public policy our own lives and our own experiences and our own values, and they permeate everything we do. And unfortunately, what I see happen with parties right now is you kind of get all squished together, and there's no latitude so much for people to represent their own district in the way it needs to be represented. And that applies to both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party right now.
So they both have some insightful things to say about individual action and representation. But change and representation are often related to personal values. And the women that I've spoken with agree that although women can bring something special to political life, their reasons are not always the same.
And we were told we could go in there and be like men. Then I kind of was a hippie sort of person. I wore flowy clothes. And so I come to the Senate and I'm wearing this 2-piece thing. It's professional. But the sergeant of arms came and said, ma'am, you can't dress like that. I said, like what? He said, like that. I said, well, how am I supposed to dress? And he basically pointed to the man. And I just kept dressing that way. I said, I'm not a man. And just kept dressing that way. When I got to Congress, it was a very interesting thing. And now there's a lot of women, not as many, but I get there and they call me Ms. Now I liked being Mrs. Some people wanted to be called Ms., and that's just fine. But I went up to the sergeant of arms and they said, I'd like you to address me as Mrs. Smith from Washington State. That's what Paul Harvey had done. Mrs. Smith goes to Washington. He did a program on me about that time. And I said, out of respect for me, each woman should be able to be called what they want. So they changed it. Then one after one, women came and asked me, how did you do that? I said, I asked. So sometimes it just takes one stepping forward. Others wouldn't even care. And I think that is what uniquely women are used to doing, because they juggle the kids, the business, the husband, the neighborhood association, and their church responsibilities, their association responsibilities, and they don't lose any of them. They always know where the kids are. We have to do that. And that's what I think makes women leaders so powerful, is that they come in knowing how to multitask.
Well, and so that's interesting.
Set with women, and perhaps Nan has too. Women, more often than not, go into politics to fix something. More so, I think, than male candidates do. Women want to fix something. And they say, when I fix this, I'll leave. Well, after they fixed it, there's something else that needs to be fixed. But I think we're fixers.
I think I was in the mode, particularly when I ran for mayor, it was more than fixing. It was, we desperately needed to get folks together and plan for our preferred future. We needed someone at the helm who would encourage that kind of outreach and discussion. And so I felt it was very important that we do our homework well, that we actually communicate with citizens and listen to citizens and each other. A lot of stuff that wasn't happening. So there was a fixing element to it, but it was for the broader picture of how is Camas going to thrive in the future.
It is powerful to think about how to create a preferred future. And that's something that each of these women learned to do in ways that really called for compromise and bipartisanship. So you'll hear a couple stories about that.
Well, I liked being able to make a difference. I enjoyed the give and take of the legislative process. I enjoyed learning things. I believe that politics is an honorable profession if it is peopled by honorable people. It is the way in this country we work out our collective differences of opinion, and we have many of them. We don't pick up guns and go shoot people. Instead, we negotiate, we bargain, we win some, we lose some, and we make public policy. I also believe that compromise at this point in time is a lost art, and it is an art. It is an art. And some of the best legislation we passed was when the House and the Senate were different parties, because we were forced to negotiate. We were forced to make concessions on both sides. And I believe that you get best public policy if all three branches are not the same party.
And people make sense to people. And so I guess you could say I started going, well, I guess I'm a Republican, but I think it's what carried me to the writing campaign. You think about that. Would all of the Democrats that had to put my name on the ballot? Because, September, you're doing a ballot from, the 10th or so into 21 days or something like that. It's just the first, September is your primary. And then you get to the halfway through it and people start this writing campaign or part of the way through it, you realize some people have already voted. So it required a bipartisan writing campaign. Now you have to know then that other people aren't as partisan either, or they wouldn't have elected me. I mean, what greater democracy than a write-in campaign? Yes, I did have to run then. I think they certified the numbers the first part of October, but that's not very long to the first part of November when the election is. Very short time. But the people also had to do it in their households. So they weren't going to rallies. They weren't getting together. There was no time to organize. It was an effort of individuals. And that power of individuals is probably why I was elected in the first place. Because I don't think we ever are as partisan as the leaders would like us to think we are.
I have to say, I agree with her, and perhaps it's the media that helps us to think that we're so different. One of the things that many of them talked about was, how do you negotiate? How do you work across party lines? How do things get done? And they get done by people sitting down at tables and really banging out solutions. So these women also talked about some of the possible differences between men and women entering into political life. And they have some pretty interesting things to say.
I think that's what Pat alluded earlier to, the fact that it appears often that more of the males, at least at the time we were in office, might have been running for ego reasons, more than most of the women involved. Is that a fair comment, Pat?
I think that's incredibly fair. Yes,
Yeah.
So often it's a line on the resume that this local office is a step up. And I don't see women devote themselves to the job that they have taken on and aren't using it as an ego builder.
We hope that continues, because when the ego gets involved, good governance takes a hit.
Mm-hmm. There have been some women I have known
Yes.
in politics, of course. But I think another thing that Nan and I both experienced was that this goes beyond local politics, because from our councils, we're assigned to other needed organizations, the League of Cities, Washington Cities. I was on the State Fire Policy Board for 9 years. CTRAN, all of these other boards that make the community run depend on the input from the appointed electeds who are there on that board. And I think that that's very often, as we're talking about the duties of a council member or a county commissioner, that these other boards are so important to the way everything runs smoothly together. And it depends on those elected officials from the local level.
I think one of the things that women need to be aware of is that they can't expect gratitude and appreciation coming from the citizenry when you're making those tough decisions, when you're busting your bun to make things happen. You take a ton of criticism, and sometimes fairly mean-spirited criticism. I think it's a true irony in my case that back when I was doing all of this that we've been talking about, I was really getting beaten up and and losing my source of income. And then fast forward 25 or 30 years, and all of a sudden somehow I'm a superstar. And back when you were getting beat up, you didn't hear that at all. And so don't expect it, ladies, because that's not necessarily going to happen. You're going to take a lot of hard knocks and wonder if it's worth it, but just keep on trying and make that positive difference.
So I really appreciate what Nan had to say. And she didn't mention this, but just 2 years ago, there was a dedication in Camas of a street called Nan Henriksen Way. So while the job seemed thankless at the time, it's clear that her public service has been appreciated. One of the things to think about is that, one of the things I think about is that women of their generation, and even very few today, go to school to become politicians. They enter into political life or into governance, as Nan will say, because there are things that matter to them. And so I think that that's a potential distinction, and one that I also hope doesn't go away, whether male or female. I hope you also get a sense of the complexities of what it takes to govern. So it isn't just elected office, but boards and commissions and people who are engaged in volunteer service. And then finally, you can really hear the gratitude that people have for the work that they've done over the long term. I'm certainly grateful to them. So this is our final segment. I asked these women to reflect on what public service meant to them. And here's what they had to say. I hope that their comments inspire you as much as they have inspired me. Thank you and have a good night. Enjoy.
I like to think that I was making a difference in how our county performed and what happened in our county. I mean, parks were important, the planning was important, sewers and getting sewer service, keeping our roads. It was a physical aspect, I think, of what we were responsible for. And I felt that I was responsive to folks who would call. And of course, I'd get calls. I get calls about barking dogs or roads not plowed or noisy parties, that sort of thing. And hopefully I was able to let our people, the citizens, feel good about their government and feel that they got response and people took them seriously and listened to what someone had to say and followed up.
I enjoyed my years in elected office. I enjoyed being able to make things happen. I worked hard to hold my ground on issues, and I know that along the way I alienated some people. I'm going to tell you that there's a certain amount of relief at not being so well known anymore. I can get out of the grocery store with anybody telling me their problems. And one day, while I was on the county commission, I pulled into a filling station and started to fill my gas tank. And the man in front of me finished filling his, and he put the nozzle back in the pump. And he turned around and he said to me, "Thank you for ruining my life." And I really was just stunned. And I said, "I beg your pardon?" And he said, "You extended 119th from Hazeldale Avenue all the way over to Lakeshore. And my property was there. And now you've shortened my driveway. I've lost property value. I hate you." We extended a road that had been on the county map for development for decades. And you impact people's lives. You may think you did a great job building a park, but this man thinks you are evil incarnate. So it's very up close and personal, and I'm glad I'm not there anymore, to tell you the truth.
From my point of success, I see that Camas at this point could be a little dead mill town like the thousands of others across the country have become. And I'm so proud that we did successfully diversify our tax base, that we planned for expansion of parks and green space and trails, that we have a community with a fine quality of life, and I'm very, very proud of that.
you know, I did write a book on the history of Camas, and the last chapter is Nan. You might call it a political hero, and she certainly was.
You know, that political hero, I guess that I'm hoping that this discussion can talk about some of those things that makes that possible, that audacity for hope for positive change, that need to have a strong moral compass within yourself if you want to run for office, that you can't just be nilly-pilly, what do you think that people will like me, what's going to happen in the next election. You've got to have that vision and strong moral compass. I would like people to know that I was always a strong believer of integrity-driven leadership, and that's what some people call the art of influencing the actions and outcomes of others in a way that builds trust and commitment. That trust and commitment. I think citizens want to know three basic things. Can I trust you? Are you committed to excellence? And do you care about me and the future of my community? Do you really care? And so no matter what kind of group I was leading, I always encouraged the group to put down their weapons and look for solutions together. Pat experienced that on the Freeholder Board, and I think they did an excellent job of that. That need to be upfront with folks and to be an excellent listener. I had to tell myself every day, Nan, listen. You're always looking for common values and common ground on which to build common solutions. So I tried to lead with grace, humor, and humility. I figured if I could just hold on to those things, that I would do pretty well. And one thing I think that women today might argue with, but I certainly found that it made sense not to worry about getting the credit, that I could get a whole lot more done by spreading the credit as far as I could ethically do it, and to say thank you and often and sincerely to those who are working with you to make good stuff happen. So there's a lot more to it than just running for office and sitting in those chairs. And those chairs really do change, ladies. I know Pat said, when you're sitting on the council, it's surely different than you thought it was going to be. Well, I'll tell you, even though I had served on the council very actively for 2 years, when I sat in the strong mayor's office, I could not believe how little I knew and how huge and complex this job is. And it's even more complex today. So it's not just the running and the glamour. There's a lot of sacrifice and exhaustion. But it's when you can look back and say, you know, your goal when you first ran was to make a positive difference in your community. And by golly, we did make a positive difference in our community. That's what it's all about.
This is what I, in my heart, believe is right. Also recognize you might make a mistake.
Yeah.
And there is two things that people in politics have a hard time with, and one is I'm sorry, and the other is I was wrong.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of times when I had to say I was wrong. Let's re-look at this.
Yeah.
Problem. Of course, the newspaper then says you're flip-flopping.
Yes.
But you're not. You're trying to do what's best for the community. Yes, there's politics and there's governing,
Mm-hmm.
and they're two different things.
Very different. In fact, when you named this politics, I kind of grimaced when you do that, because I never saw myself as a politician. I saw myself as a leader of people and a community improver, but not a politician. So that's just my bias. Yeah.
It was a magnificent experience. And as I was getting ready for this interview, I was trying to leaf through some of my old campaign materials and some of the work I did on different bills and at the county. You don't realize it at the time, but if you are effective, you can make major differences in people's lives. And I used to try to explain to people, especially when I was at the county, that the County Board of Commissioners has more influence over your life than the president. Because we can, only takes 2 votes at that point, only took 2 votes. We can come to a meeting in the morning and we can rezone all of the property adjacent to you on the west. We can then add a sales tax. We can go for lunch. We can come back and we can rezone all the property that's on the other side of you, and we can take away your park, and we can be done by 3 and on the golf course by 4. That's how much influence local government has that most people don't understand. And it was stunning to me when I first moved to the county. 2 votes, that's all it takes. When I was in the legislature, if I wanted to make anything happen, I had to get 50 votes in the House, 25 votes in the Senate, and 1 vote in the governor's mansion. Now that's a heavy lift. And I came to the county and it's like, you mean I only need 1 other vote? That was it. Which was one of the reasons that I was so involved with the campaign for the charter, because you shouldn't be able to make those kinds of impacts on people's lives with just 2 votes. Now, under the charter, you can do it with 3, but still it's more than 2. It's 50% more again. So you can make huge differences in people's lives. I was a great fan of parks and did everything I could to help us build parks and ball fields for kids. And every time I'm up at Philida Park to walk my dog, I just kind of get this feeling of surprise, to be perfectly honest with you, that I was a part of creating anything that collected people and brought them peace as much as a park does, or that caused as many children to laugh. You go to the park, well, the kids are there and they're just laughing on the playground equipment. The youngsters are practicing soccer. The parents are around, and it's still mystifying to me that I was able to do some of that. So what do I think of public service? I am mystified by the good you can do.
I feel guilt when I say I love you, 'cause I say it so often, but I hope you believe. No matter how dopey or crazy you talk, you gotta keep right by. It doesn't matter at all. You lit me up, don't break me down. You lit me up, don't break me down. Come to me in my new age life. wake up on a Sunday morning, just wanna kiss you, know you love you, 'cause you know you're my darling. Building me up, don't break me down. Building me up, don't break me down. Building me up. Let it be known. Oh, let it die away to keep from me. Let it be known. Oh, let it die away to keep from me. Let it be known. Oh, let it die away to keep from me. Let it be known. Standing here, room is long, voices on the rise, dog is staring back at me, foot a seat and the trees that keep you in the shade, moving up and down this street, water royals under lights, she's watching the box, got magic in her fingertips, keep it here in your mind, let it burn, some shivers up and down your spine, travel there, sacred choice, sand in your hair, the waves they crash upon your thighs, reeds they bend, bow their heads, golden black, got pieces of a different world, shake your head, makes no sense, from where you stand, you hold them all in your listen deep to the glow, see a smile, the brightest note you've ever known, in the ditch, found your path, climbing still, the wreckage all around.